So let's first start by discussing what type of stretches they are and then the benefits of them, and then we'll go into what you've got to do during a warm-up, what stretches you've got to do after you've exercised, and then we can look at scenarios where you shouldn't be stretching or how you can overdo stretches. Then lastly, I'll give you my examples of static stretches and dynamic stretches that I like, and I've also created PDFs that you can download from the blog post that has a list with pictures of these exercises in. And then I'll get to all your questions and see which ones I haven't answered yet. Good, so the two main types of stretches that I'm going to discuss today are static stretches and dynamic stretches. So static stretches is exactly what the name says. It's a stretch that you take into a position and you hold it there for a length of time. So probably one of the most famous ones is the hamstring stretch, where you sit with the leg out in front of you and you just lean into it. And you can feel the stretch and you maintain it there for a period of time. A dynamic stretch is when you move through the range of movement into a position where you can feel a stretch sensation, but you don't stay there for very long before you come back out of it. So a good example of that, and I will show you more examples in a minute, is, say for instance, instead of doing a strong stretch for the thigh muscle, you can do a lunge, a deep lunge movement, where you can feel the front of the thigh stretching, but you're not actually keeping it in that position for very long. And I'll explain the benefits of them both in a minute. So why would you use static stretches? Well, the research have shown that they're really good at increasing your range of movement. Dynamic stretches can also increase your range of movement, but they're not quite as effective as static stretches. So if range of movement is important to you, that's one that you should be doing before sport. Now, the second thing that a static stretch can do is it can unfortunately switch off your muscle function. So that sounds quite dramatic, but all it means is that, remember, our muscles are controlled through the nervous system. And there are certain things that activates the nervous system, makes it more reactive, and then there are certain things that calms it down and just puts it to sleep a little bit. And a static stretch that you hold for longer than 45 seconds can put your muscles to sleep a little bit. So that means if you do a very long sustained stretch and then immediately try and do your sport, your muscles may not contract as well as they would normally. Now, importantly, also, new research in recent years have shown that you don't have to really worry about that effect as long as you hold the static stretch for less than 45 seconds and you follow it up with dynamic stretches to activate the muscle. Then they've shown that you don't get any decrease in performance from it. So when this research first came out that showed that static stretches could switch your muscles off, everybody was shouting that you shouldn't be doing them before your sport. But a lot of people then said, you know what, we've done them for a very long time before sport and the athletes have been fine. And they looked at how the studies were conducted and they realized that the studies weren't really done in the way that you would do it as part of a normal warm-up routine. So then when they went to and tested it as you would do it during a normal warm-up routine, they found it didn't have a negative effect. But I will get onto that in a little bit again. So, and then the last thing that about static stretches is there's no evidence that it helps for muscle soreness. You know, when you train, you sometimes get a couple of days later, your muscles really hurt. Unfortunately, static stretches doesn't really help to get that pain to decrease. What it can do is just give your range of movement back for you. Now, what about dynamic stretches? So yes, dynamic stretches can improve your range of movement for you. So before you go for a run, it can be quite a good one to get everything loosened off that you can move easily. Then secondly, they've been shown to activate your muscles to get them ready for exercise. So when they've done dynamic stretches before they tested people's sprint abilities and jump abilities, they found that actually they performed a lot better if they've activated the muscle groups. And that is because if you look at this position again, when I do this stretch, not only am I getting a lengthening of this muscle, but I'm actually actively contracting this one and telling it to wake up. Okay, same thing for if we're going to swing the leg. We're getting the range of movement through there, but we're actually using the hamstring muscle to pull the leg back again. So at the same time, activating it again. So that's a really, really big plus point and a reason why it should be part of your warm-up routine. Now, it does have a negative effect if you do too many of the active movements. And um, researchers were initially quite surprised at this result that they found because it was contrary to all the other research out there showing that dynamic stretches could improve performance. And then they realized that it may have been that the dynamic stretches or movements that they got the people to do in the studies actually tired the athletes out so that then they couldn't perform well in sprinting because they were already tired. So it's really important to choose the dynamic movements that's right for your level of fitness and what you've trained towards. And then lastly, what about delayed onset muscle soreness? Active stretches doesn't do anything to prevent that. Unfortunately, it again can give you some range of movement back, but it won't take the pain away that you feel with that. Okay, so let's get on to what should you be doing as part of your warm-up routine. Now, there's a very easy way to decide, and there are two things that you need to keep in mind. One is what sport you're about to do, and the second is what's your body telling you on the day. So let me explain about what sport. So take, for instance, a gymnast. If you think of the movements that they've got to do during their sport, during their training and their competition, they need large ranges of movement, and they've got to be able to go through the full range of movement during the competition and training. So for them, doing static stretches as part of the warm-up is actually really important because it's the only way that they will get that full range of movement. Now, a runner don't need nearly as much range of movement. They just need to be able to move their legs forwards and backwards as far as they should. So they may get away with just doing dynamic movements to get that range of movement that they need. Now, the second thing I want you to consider is how your body feels on that day. So let's take the runner again, for example. On a regular day, you may feel that you're a little bit tight and stiff, but after you've done your dynamic stretches, everything has loosened off and you're ready to go. But what if you've sat all day? You may find that your hip flexors become really, really tight and they're just not loosening off with the dynamic stretches. On days like that, it may be worth fitting in an extra static stretch for those muscle groups just to get your range of movement back and then following it up with dynamic stretches. So what I will say is if you're going to include static stretches as part of your warm-up routine, you've got to make sure that you keep them for less than 45 seconds. On average, people tend to say 30 seconds and less, and I feel that's quite safe because that's well below 45 seconds. And you have to follow it up with dynamic movements that actually actively contract that muscle that you've just stretched statically to wake it back up. I hope that makes sense. Okay, then so first of all, for how long should you hold the static stretches? Well, as long as it's less than 45 seconds, you're good to go. So decide for yourself what feels right for you on that day. There's no recipe to that. With regards to dynamic movements, again, there's no recipe. But as I said earlier, what they found was if they made the people do too many, it decreased performance because they actually got tired. And then interestingly enough, if you're looking for explosive strength, so if you're going to do a sprint session or you're going to do an activity that involves jumping or quick movements, doing the dynamic stretches or movements as quickly as possible gave them much better increases in performance than doing it at a moderate pace. So that's the two things you can keep in mind for warming up with dynamic moves. Okay, so moving on, you've done your sport and now you're warming down or it's later in the day. What should you do stretching wise afterwards? Now, one of the things that I forgot that has been shown with regards to regular stretching is that you can actually avoid acute muscle strains in sprinting if you have good flexibility in your muscles. It doesn't seem to have an effect on any overuse injuries, so like Achilles tendinopathies and things like that. You can't prevent that through stretching. It's more your acute muscle sprains. So static stretches does have a role to play after exercise, definitely. And what I would say is that if you combine it with good breathing techniques while you're doing it, you're getting the added benefit that you're actually decreasing your cortisol levels and you're decreasing your stress. So what I normally advise my patients to do is to take the stretch to where you can just start feeling the tightness or restriction. If you do a really strong stretch and try to force the movement, all you're doing is setting off the body's alarm systems and it's going to go into protective mode. So you're not actually going to get a switching off of the muscle and a relaxation of it. And that's what you're aiming to get with this. So make sure you don't force it too hard. And then hold it for anything between 30 to 40 seconds. And I usually do 2 or 3 repetitions on each leg. There is really no evidence out there that says there's a certain recipe that works better than another. So it all depends on what you find works for you. We're all genetically different, so it may be different from person to person. Now, when should you avoid stretching? The first instance is when you've got an acute injury. So any injuries, I would say that's younger than 7 days. So we're talking muscle tears, sprains, strains, anything where you've injured yourself. If you're going to go do strong static stretches, you will likely make it worse. And the reason for that is whenever you strain something, you inevitably tear some of the muscle fibers or the cells. Now you can imagine if you're going to go and stretch that strongly, you're not going to do your healing process any good. The better option for injuries is to do active movement. So I guess you can say that it's a dynamic stretch, but it's a very gentle dynamic stretch. I'm going to take my wrist as an example, just because it's an easy example. If I've sprained my wrist and it's really stiff and tight, you want to start moving it, but I wouldn't force it into pain. I would just gently move it to where you feel the first restriction. And you know what? It's really interesting because the more you do it just short of pain, you'll find the more flexible it becomes because you're improving the circulation and allowing all the fluid and things just to move better. Saying that, there are definitely certain injuries that react really well to stretching, and it's usually the type of injury that has a lot of muscle spasm with it. So if muscle spasm or tightness is your main issue, then it may actually react really well to stretching. But the problem is, it's very difficult to decide what muscle spasm is there just because the muscles are annoyed with you, and what's actually protective muscle spasm, in which case, again, you don't want to be stretching it. So I would really advise that you consult a physiotherapist or somebody like that to get your injury diagnosed and then get some guidance as to what you need to be doing with it. And good example is when people find that they injure their lower backs and it feels really locked up and tight and they can't hardly move. And they often try strong stretches for that because they feel that they need to get it moving again. But very often that spasm is there to protect the injury and it will decrease as the injury heals. So strong stretching is not always useful for that. Now the second one is when you've got other types of injuries, like for instance, tendon injuries like tendonitis or tendinosis. Achilles tendinosis or tendinopathy is a good example. If you're going to stretch an injured tendon really strongly, you will know about it the next day and you'll hardly be able to walk. So again, it's all about the diagnosis and what type of treatment that specific injury needs. Another example that was given in the group today is when you've got nerve root pain. So especially with the sciatic nerve, it runs right through the piriformis. So the piriformis muscle often becomes really tight and sore. And people tend to think, oh no, if I just stretch that out, or sometimes people go and massage it really hard with an elbow, then it'll decrease. But if it's the nerve that's driving that tightness, then you're actually going to throw that or shoot that pain through the ceiling. Same thing, if your sciatic nerve is the cause of your pain in the leg and the reason it's feeling tight, if you do any stretch like a hamstring stretch, it will really set it off and it will make the pain worse. So definitely don't stretch any injuries that has nerve involvement unless you've been told so by a physio or healthcare professional. And even then, I would be very gentle with it and just see how it reacts to it. Okay, so can you overstretch? Yes. Just like you can overtrain with exercise, you can definitely also overstretch. Now, when we think of dynamic stretches, the main problem that will come in with that is that your performance will drop because you'll be tired when you go into exercise. If we think of static stretches, our joints has a normal limit to range of movement where it shouldn't really be moving past. So, and our ligaments are meant to stop that range of movement. So look at my finger. If I try to bend it back, I can't. And that's because my ligaments are stopping it from going further. And that's actually protecting the joint. So whilst overly tight joints aren't great, there's also a natural end where you should be getting to. And that natural end is different for all of us because we've got different bodies. Our shapes are different, our skeleton's different, our flexibility that's internal to our muscles and our structures and our tendons are different. So one person has a lot more pliable tendons and things than the other. So definitely do not compare yourself to somebody else when you think about how flexible you should be. And honestly, except for acute muscle strains in sprinters, there's no evidence that being very flexible prevents injuries. And to be honest, with sprinters, it's not that they've got to be extremely flexible, it's just that they need their proper range of movement. Okay, so don't go and overstretch in that way. The second way that you can overstretch with static stretches is if you are too forceful. If you go in and you really force the movement. I tend to say politely ask the muscle to move. So go into the stretch at a very low level and just sustain it there. You will find that it actually releases a lot better then. Okay. That's the other thing that I wanted to point out. Having a large range of movement in your muscles and your limbs is really of no use if you can't control it properly. So a good example of that is Djokovic, tennis player. And even Murray, to be honest. I don't know if you've seen, especially when they were in their heydays and before all the injuries came along, they were giving massive strides and going after balls and getting them and controlling it and being back that way. So they had large range of movement, but they've strengthened themselves through that range. If you're just going to work on flexibility to get large ranges of movement, but you're not actually strengthening your muscles up in those ranges, you're also looking for trouble because then you can get uncontrolled movement. Now, that's not so important for normal running because running is pretty much in a contained line. So as long as you strengthen it in that line, you should be fine. But yes, it's more important for other sports where you have to step and move quickly. Excellent. So then we're going to move on to examples of stretches. Now, these are by no means the only stretches you can do. They are just my favorite ones that I've chosen that I find most people get on with. So they're a nice safe set of exercises. Saying that, they may not be right for you. So please, if you get any pain or discomfort when you're doing them, chat to somebody about it because you're not meant to. Okay, so we'll start off with the static stretches. And I prefer to start with my hip flexors, but you can really start with any of them. So my favorite one, you've got to remember that your hip flexors are made up of your iliopsoas at the front that just crosses over the hip, but then also your rec fem that goes over the knee. So there's two parts to that. The first is just hinging forwards and in a stride position and just holding that. Now, I want you to not push yourself like that because then you won't feel the full stretch. You've got to pull your pelvis backwards, then you'll increase that stretch at the front. If you allow the pelvis to just drop forwards, you're not going to feel it so much. So after you've held it in that position for, my preferred time is 30 seconds, then you can try and catch your foot as well. Now that makes it quite a strong stretch, so you may find you've got to come out of it a little bit, but ideally you want to still maintain that position. And eventually you want to get the full stretch that the heel can touch nearly to your bottom. Okay, so just be aware that you don't go and do that with your lower back. Keep your tummy muscles in and your pelvis back. So that's my favorite hip flexor and quad stretch. Then, if we move on to the glutes. Now, I tend to always stretch the glute muscles before you go into the hamstring stretch. And the reason for that is the hamstring stretch, as I mentioned before, also stretches your sciatic nerve. Sorry. I've been struggling with a bit of a cold. Okay. So you want to loosen your hips off before you stretch your nerve. So my old favorite is the figure 4, where you cross your leg onto the other one. Show you this side, just there. And you want to grab with both hands this leg and pull it to your chest. And you should be feeling the stretch in this buttock. So show you from this side, where I feel the stretch is in there, but also a little bit in there. And that's absolutely fine. As long as it's a stretch and it's not a pain, sorry about this, then it's absolutely fine. So the second one is your piriformis stretch. And for this, you're again in this position, but now you're going to cross your legs slightly further over. You're going to place one hand on the lower part of the leg, other hand comes onto the knee, and you're going to pull it to your opposite shoulder. Now, if you let this arm go, you're not going to feel the stretch. And also, if you let the knee come across to the other shoulder, you're not going to feel the stretch. So it's got to be there and cross over, pulling with this leg. And you're feeling it right in your buttock. Slightly more intense than the other one. So just in there. Okay. Good. Then the butterfly stretch for the inner thighs. Now this is a big one where people tend to really try and force it down. Even for myself, that's really strong stretch right into where the adductors attach. So I prefer to just rest my back against the wall and I just let gravity take it down. Now I don't even get my feet really close to my bottom because that just makes it hurt even more. So you just want to feel a gentle stretch. And then after I've done this one, I prefer to go into the hamstring stretch. So I often actually alternate this one and the hamstring stretch. So I would hold this for about 30-40 seconds, and then I would straighten one leg out and just slide towards it. Now the big thing with this is if you make sure that the opposite hand also reaches towards the foot, you're going to feel a very nice stretch all along your spine on the opposite side. So it's a really nice all-in-one stretch. And you'll notice I'm not trying to grab my foot. I'm making it a gentle stretch by just sliding down to where I feel I can hold it. And actually today, it's my lower back stopping me going further. It's not my muscles in my leg. So I would sit there and stretch the lower back out for a little bit. The key is that you have to keep your knee straight. So if you can reach really far, but your knee pops up into flexion, that doesn't count because then you're not really getting the full stretch. So if you find you can just get to there with the knee straight, then that's as far as you go. Other important thing, and let me show you, I don't think you can see that there, is don't pull your toes up while you're doing it because that makes it a nervy stretch again. Just keep the foot relaxed or even pointing down and you just slide towards it. And I would do that on both sides and then go back into the butterfly stretch. Okay, so what are we? Then the last one is the calf stretch. So for the calf stretch, I'm pretty sure most people know this one. It's where you've got one leg in front of the other and you bend the front knee. So I'm trying to keep the heel of the back leg on the floor and I'm feeling a stretch in this area. Okay, so there we go. And just watch out that your foot's not turned to the side because then you won't actually get the inside of the calf. Your toes have to be pointing straight forwards. And then you can just bend the lower or the back knee to feel the stretch slightly lower. For me, that doesn't really stretch. Mine stretches most if I have it there. Excellent. So that is all of the passive stretches or the static stretches. Now, if we move into the dynamic ones, you're not going to see a face for this because otherwise I don't get my body in properly. We're going to start off with just knee hugs. So it's literally what it says. You bring your leg up, hug it into you, and then the other one. And you just keep it for a few seconds. And the idea is that you just get a nice stretch through this area. Then you can follow that up, hold on to something for balance if you need to, and just open the hips up. So again, it's a nice one to get the hips moving and get the range of movement there that you need. Then after that, as you by now know, my favorite one is a lunge dip to get the range of movement through the front of the thigh and get your extension. Because remember, especially if you're running, you need to be able to take your leg through this full range. And then what I tend to do is after I've done the lunge dips and loosen both sides off, I tend to do lunge walks. So literally just walking and going deep into that. And that really activates the glutes as well as the quads for you. Then following that up with some swings for the hamstring. Again, getting hip extension, but also making sure that your leg is free to swing forwards when you're running. And then, of course, also to show you from this side, a bit of sideways swinging. Okay, but it's controlled swinging. It's not as rough as you can. And you hold on so that you're not falling all over the space. And then lastly, I would say do the calves as well. And for this, I find it really useful if I'm outside and there's a curb or something and I can do it over the curb, but you can just do it to floor level. And it's literally just on one leg, going up and down on your toes. And just saying to the calf, come on now, wake up please. Okay. You can add things like single leg squats, and you can do single leg deadlifts. You can do anything that activates the muscles and gets you the range of movement. So what I would suggest is look at your own body, look at the sport you're about to do, what range of movement do you need, and then feel what you feel in your body. What are your tight parts? Is it your lower back? Is it your hips at the front? Are your calves the issue? And try and build your stretches around that you get a full set that works for you. And remember, if you're going to do static stretches as a warm-up, less than 45 seconds, and make sure you follow them up with dynamic movements afterwards. Thank you for watching. If you would like to learn more about preventing sports injuries, make sure you hit the subscribe button. See you next time.